Support for the Legislative Gazette comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities with the Public Schools Unite Us initiative, and United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org. New York's prison system has been under intense scrutiny in recent months. Corrections officers at a prison near Utica were charged with murdering an inmate. Another inmate was also allegedly beaten to death at a nearby prison. And the 3-week wildcat strike by corrections officers created chaos and highlighted a dire staffing shortage in the system. Advocates and many state lawmakers think one solution to this moment is to close more prisons, but the communities that are home to these facilities, many of them in northern New York, say that move is misguided and would devastate local economies. We get more from North Country Public Radio's Emily Russell.
To understand where we are today, we have to go back in time, back to the early 1970s. New York City was in the midst of a drug crisis. So in 1973, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller signed a strict new drug law.
The new law provides much harsher penalties than those now in effect.
This is archival news tape from the Associated Press.
An example, the convicted seller of 1 ounce of heroin must serve a minimum of 15 years. The seller of a pound of heroin, 15 years to life with no possibility of parole.
In the decade that followed, New York State's prison population would go from 13,000 to more than 30,000. Most of the people newly convicted for nonviolent drug charges were black and brown people. And the state needed somewhere to send all those people. One place it turned to was the North Country. Many folks here saw it as an economic opportunity. Why did you want to bring a state prison to Mariah?
Jobs.
Tom Scazafava was the town supervisor of Mariah in Essex County. This was back in the late 80s.
They were good paying jobs. They, not only the correction officers, but civilian positions. And, we needed the jobs.
Mariah had been struggling for years. The local mine had closed down more than a decade earlier. So when the new prison in Mariah opened in 1989, Scazafava says he was thrilled. His hometown and the area around it saw new signs of life.
There was a couple stores in Mineville that opened up, mom and pop stores. There was a drugstore, new houses going up from correction officers that lived and worked here, and civilian employees. So there was a huge difference.
By that time, the state's prison population had grown from 30,000 to more than 50,000, and it kept rising. Prisons were popping up all across the North Country. This rural region, with just 2% of the state's population, now had 24% of its prisons. Most were massive facilities that each incarcerated and employed hundreds of people. The prison in Mariah was on the smaller side. It had about 100 staff. But 100 people with good-paying jobs and good benefits, that can make a real difference in a town like Mariah. Plus, prison visitors were coming here and spending some money. Bouillet's Grocery and Deli is just down the road from the prison. Owner John Bouillet says prison visitors were regular customers here.
They travel 4 or 5 hours sometimes, and they sometimes just patronize the businesses, wait for the facility to be open to be able to go do visitation. And some of those families we'd actually see more often.
By the late 1990s, New York's prison population hit its peak. There were more than 72,000 people incarcerated in the state's 72 prisons. According to state data, about a third of the population was locked up on drug charges.
And that Rockefeller drug law was ridiculous. I mean, it was overkill.
That's David Hebert. He was a corrections officer in the North Country from the late 90s until just a few years ago when he retired.
They were locking people up that never should have been locked up. So when they finally repealed the Rockefeller drug laws, that was good, and it did drop the inmate population by quite a bit.
That inmate population began to drop by about 1,000 inmates every year since its peak in the late 90s. In 2009, then Governor David Paterson closed a small prison near Saranac Lake known as Camp Gabriel's. That move would kickstart a push to shutter prisons, including a bunch in the North Country, in places like Chateauguay, Lion Mountain, and Watertown. One of the most recent closures was Great Meadow in Washington County. Republican State Senator Dan Steck spoke at a rally there last summer, just months before it closed. He mirrored the crowd's anger at Democratic lawmakers in Albany.
They said, we're going to close a big one far away. No one cares. No one lives there. I'll tell you who lives there. 65,000 people in Washington County live here. 66,000 people in Warren County live here. 32,000 people in Essex County live here. Great Meadow, 650 employees, is the largest employer in Washington County.
But it's this argument that the state should keep prisons open in part to preserve local jobs that many leaders in Albany have pushed back on. When Governor Andrew Cuomo took office, closing prisons was a top priority. Here he is at his first State of the State address in 2011.
An incarceration program is not an employment program. If people need jobs, let's get people jobs.
Since that speech, the state has closed more than 24 prisons. Cuomo's successor, Governor Kathy Hochul, has kept up that effort, closing 8 in just the last few years. That includes the prison in Moriah, where David Hebert spent most of his career as a CO. He really loved what he did and says the closing stung and impacted the whole region.
It was devastating. You know, we were a family at Moriah, and Moriah was the largest employer in that community. And it didn't just affect them, it affected people from all around. Like myself, I was traveling from Keysville. There's people traveling from Sable Forks, from Plattsburgh, from as far south as like Port Edward.
This ebb and flow of prisons opening in the 1980s and 90s and closing just decades later has frustrated a lot of folks around the region. Plus, all those prisons that the state has closed in the North Country have sat empty, falling into disrepair. Marcia Weissman says places like Moriah are partly to blame for the ups and downs. Weissman is a professor at Syracuse University and previously ran a nonprofit aimed at helping formerly incarcerated people.
Communities were competing for these prisons. So they share a burden of a part of the responsibility for not thinking through the deal that they were making with the devil.
The deal was this. Communities like Moriah got new jobs and an economic boost from prisons. But they did so at the expense of incarcerating mostly Black and brown men and choosing to be part of a prison system that many advocates say destabilized communities, destroyed families, and cost all New Yorkers hundreds of millions of dollars. Today, the state's prison population is half of what it was in the 90s. Staffing levels are also down by more than 50%. Officers say the staffing shortage and other recent reforms have created dangerous working conditions in prisons, which led to the recent 3-week wildcat strike. Meanwhile, Governor Hochul is citing that staffing shortage as a reason to close 5 more prisons in the next year. She and the state legislature included that provision in their draft budgets. Here's Hochul at a recent press conference.
We're going to continue focusing on the environment there, improving the conditions as best we can, but I need to consolidate now so I can manage the population with the fewer people that I have that are doing it.
Despite all the closures in the last 2 decades, the North Country is still home to about a quarter of the state's remaining prisons. So if Hochul closes 5 more in the next year, odds are that 1 or more will be here in the North Country. A few years after the local prison in Moriah closed, Matthew Brassard took over as town supervisor. He says the truth is that prisons were an economic lifeline for rural towns like his.
They were jobs programs and they were needed. And now that they're gone, it's a shame.
One industry Brassard feels hopeful about now is tourism. Moriah is right on Lake Champlain, and it's near other hubs in the area like Burlington, Plattsburgh, and Lake Placid. But he says that can be a tough sell in a town with an aging population that lived through the recent mining and prison booms.
You know, change is scary. I mean, change is scary for a lot of people, including myself. But if we don't pivot into a different direction, you know, we're just going to keep spiraling down and eventually we won't have any businesses.
This community, like so many other former prison towns, now has to figure out what comes next. In Moriah, I'm Emily Russell for the New York Public News Network.
are listening to the Legislative Gazette, a program about New York State government and politics. I'm David Guistina. This week I sat down with Jimmy Vielkind, public media reporter for WNYC and The Gothamist. We began our discussion about the now late-state budget addressing the elephant in the room, the ongoing funding cuts from the federal government and their impact on New York.
So it's a $252 billion budget, and about $93 billion of that, that's roughly 30%, is money that's going to come from the federal government. Now, New York is controlled right now by an all-Democratic government. Coming out of the Biden administration, there's a whole lot of federal money that started to flow, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. And right now, Democrats in Albany are planning their budget as though that federal funding is going to stay roughly constant. Now, if anyone knows what's going on in Washington, that might not be the best assumption. Republicans, led by President Donald Trump, have signaled that they want to cut federal spending, and a lot of that federal spending flows through states. So there's a very, very big risk that things like the Medicaid program, which is funded jointly by the state and federal government, will be significantly cut in the coming months when Washington lawmakers put together their own federal budget. So that's a really big risk. And there's some debate as to whether or not New York should have set itself up to prepare for that, or whether it should just kind of hope for the best and plan for the best, which seems to be what they're doing now.
That's just one. Medicaid. That's just one area we're talking about being impacted. What about the MTA? Now, we saw the president of the United States, Donald Trump, go after the congestion pricing plan. They want to stop that. That's $9 below 60th Street. And a lot of that in the language was about paying off this MTA bill. But if you knock out this money, now that's a larger bill. So the MTA needs money to survive.
The MTA needs money. And that's number two of my 6 chunks of the budget is how much money they're going to give to the MTA and what they're going to give. And actually, it's even more complicated because congestion pricing, well, let me take a step back. The MTA has to run, the trains have to run, maybe on time, maybe not on time, but the trains have to run, and they have an operating budget for that. Then they're always thinking about how can they improve the system? When do they need to buy new train cars? When do they need to replace the electronics for the signals, etc.? And they plan that work in 5-year chunks. A 5-year capital plan is the technical term. And so congestion pricing was to support a chunk of the 5-year capital plan that's ending. Now they're talking about a new capital plan of more than $60 billion, and they're looking for ways to fund it. So state lawmakers are expected to come up with a couple $1 billion to pay for it. And there's some talk that they'll raise payroll taxes in New York City and perhaps also in the surrounding region that's served by the MTA, that being Long Island and the lower Hudson Valley. So this is still up in the air. No one seems to really want to lead on it. We've heard Governor Hochul talk about raising the payroll tax. We've heard some other a little bit more unorthodox ideas coming out of the state legislature. One that I think is interesting is our package delivery fee. So if you order something in the 5 boroughs on Amazon, say, then there's a fee on that package delivery that would then go to fund mass transit. So that is sort of budget fight number 2, money for the MTA. And as you said, David, if the feds reduce their funding, it's only going to make it harder.
Not only that, but I heard Governor Hochul this week talking on MSNBC about Liberation Day and the president announcing tariffs on all these countries and goods. And she talked about the rebate checks she wants to give New Yorkers up to $5,000, and basically said with the way the tariffs now are going, it's going to erase any kind of gain because it's basically a giant tax on New Yorkers for whatever they're going to shop for.
Well, that's right. And that kind of gets into budget bucket number 1, the federal risk. So in addition to being reliant on federal aid, New York's budget is reliant on really wealthy people. The biggest source of state revenue in New York is the personal income tax. And the people who pay the personal income tax, or the lion's share of it, are not public radio superstars like you and me, David. We don't get into that millionaire's tax bracket. It's really major financial industry players in Wall Street. And so as these tariffs have been rolled out by President Trump, we've seen stock market indices crash. We've seen increase in volatility. We've seen predictions of a recession this year rise from some of the leading economic forecasters. all of that is going to trickle down into perhaps lower tax receipts for New York State. So that's sort of another budget problem that's looming on the horizon for Governor Hochul and the state legislature. Of course, as we're taping this, the tariffs are still in their very, very early phases of being rolled out, but it's definitely a big risk factor. And as the governor said, she was hoping to spend about $3 billion on rebate checks, mostly targeted to middle-income New Yorkers. And if there isn't the money to pay for that, there won't be checks for New Yorkers. She's sort of laying out the stakes quite clearly as to what is on the chopping block here. And, it's going to remain to be seen that if lawmakers need to come back and adjust the budget because of economic conditions or because of a loss of federal aid, these are kind of the first things that are likely to go.
That's Jimmy Vielkind, public media reporter for WNYC and The Gothamist. You are listening to the Legislative Gazette, a program about New York State government and politics. I'm David Guistina. Former Governor Andrew Cuomo is attempting to make his return to politics by winning New York City's mayoral race. But while Cuomo's supporters say he's a just, tough-talking New Yorker, his critics, including some municipal leaders across the state, call him a bully. Jung Yoon Han from the New York Public News Network has more.
There is no New York rivalry quite like the one between former Governor Andrew Cuomo and former New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. They fought over everything: who had the power to shut down the city during the pandemic, who had control over the city subways, how to fund de Blasio's idea to provide universal pre-K in the city. Here's what de Blasio said about Cuomo back in 2015, speaking to Spectrum News New York One.
What we've often seen is if someone disagrees with him openly, some kind of revenge or vendetta follows.
De Blasio's statement resonated with many municipal leaders who complained that Cuomo would Bigfoot them on local issues. Some leaders thought that dynamic would become part of the past when Cuomo resigned in 2021 amid scandals over nursing centers during the pandemic and sexual harassment allegations. But now, Cuomo is trying to make a comeback by running for, of all things, de Blasio's old job. Stephanie Miner was mayor of Syracuse when Cuomo took office in 2011. She says his behavior then and now is much like how she sees President Donald Trump's.
He is a bully and yells and screams and mischaracterizes information.
Miner says her relationship with Cuomo turned south when she wrote an op-ed opposing the governor's pension plan in 2013. At the time, her city was set to receive infrastructure funding through the state, but she says the administration ended up withholding it in retaliation.
And I was told that the governor had said that Syracuse will never get that money as long as Stephanie Miner is mayor. And we did not. And shortly after I left office, that money was released to my successor.
Ultimately, she says, Cuomo did not come through on his promises. Case in point, the Buffalo Billion. Cuomo announced the initiative to inject $1 billion into Buffalo's economy in 2012, but an audit from the state comptroller in 2020 found the project failed to deliver on jobs and economic growth. Bob Duffy, who was Cuomo's lieutenant governor during the initial Buffalo Billion rollout, says overall the governor's initiatives did benefit local communities. Duffy points to Cuomo's regional economic development councils, which they established to help fund local projects.
The governor and his team in the state would, without fail, fund, at least 1, 2, or 3 of each of the region's priority projects every year.
Cuomo supporters also say his initial handling of the COVID pandemic is proof of his competency. But leaders on the local level say his leadership was chaotic and lacked transparency, which led to only more confusion. Rensselaer County Executive Steve McLaughlin says during daily COVID briefings, Cuomo would make executive orders without notice.
Nobody knew what was going to happen until it happened. So at the county level, we're shaking our heads going, you got to be kidding me.
Setting the pandemic aside, for Stephen Aquario, who's the executive director of the New York State Association of Counties, he sees Cuomo's behavior differently.
He always was curious about local government and how the state could and should work with them.
Aquario describes Cuomo as a strong-headed leader who's, sure, opinionated, but not someone who's a bully.
To work in this space, you got to deal with strong personalities who are under tremendous pressure and with tremendous responsibility.
As for McLaughlin, he's not surprised Cuomo is now running for mayor.
I find that pretty ironic that this is the same guy that looked down on us, wouldn't communicate with us, that now he wants to be one of us.
In a statement, Cuomo spokesperson Rich Azzopardi wrote that the former governor has a proven track record of serving New Yorkers and called the criticisms against Cuomo, quote, revisionist history. In Albany, I'm Jung-Yun Han for the New York Public News Network.
You are listening to the Legislative Gazette, a program about New York State government and politics. I'm David Gustina. After PFAS contamination was first detected more than a decade ago, the village of Hoosick Falls is now celebrating a new water supply. The Legislative Gazette's Samantha Simmons reports on the community that had become the focus of a national conversation around clean drinking water.
So on the live stream right now, that is our water operator, Jim Hurlbert, officially making the switch.
Concerns over drinking water began in 2014 when a local resident tested his water after his father died of a rare form of cancer. But it wasn't until 2016 that the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation confirmed the presence of PFAS chemicals in the Hoosick Falls municipal water system. The so-called emerging contaminants linked to local industrial sites were unregulated, and at the time, there wasn't much the village could do on its own. On Monday evening, following years of investigations and litigation, the village switched on its new water supply. Surrounded by residents, family members, and state officials who helped make remediation possible, outgoing village mayor Rob Allen choked up as he discussed the hardships the community faced.
Finally, I want to thank all of the families of our village's elected officials and our village employees. They are the ones picking up the pieces and taking on more work so that we could do our important work for our village. I specifically want to thank my wife, Heather, who has had to endure 8 years of a distracted, overworked, and overwhelmed husband. 8 years of her own personal sacrifice and time lost for the benefit of the village and our communities.
Elected in 2017, Allen dedicated his time in office to fighting for clean water. Before that, Allen, who still works as a music teacher, became an advocate for clean drinking water in his community, urging leaders to seek environmental justice. Allen did not seek re-election in March's village races. The ceremony was a remarkable moment on the now former official's last day in office. PFAS chemicals, including PFOA, the primary contaminant found in Hoosick Falls water, are used in a number of applications. The contamination was linked to the St. Gobain Performance Plastics facility in the village. Longtime resident Michael Hickey was the person who sounded the alarm after his father's death. Through tears, Hickey says the bonds created among villagers while fighting for their health are unbreakable.
We're in a really good spot. We know that we're safe from the water supply and all the other resources that we have coming in. So I think that we're in a really good
Hickey
spot.
thanked St. Gobain and Honeywell for taking responsibility for the cleanup.
It's unfortunate what happened here, but they did step up in the end. And there's continuing to have negotiations, and there's still work that needs to be done. It's not completely done, right? There's still things that need to be completed. But I think they stepped up and have done the right thing. And I think that they've made our community better, and they should be proud of themselves as well for doing the right thing.
Last year, Hoosick Falls broke ground on a 6,800-foot raw water transmission line that runs between the recently developed LaCroix well field and the village's water treatment plant. Interim New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Commissioner Amanda Lefton says her team's work over the past decade has alerted the agency about emerging contamination across the state. And she says the DEC is not done with Hoosick Falls.
So we have a new water source, but importantly, we still want to clean up the mess. So we are continuing to focus on remediation. So we focused first, of course, on clean water. That was priority number one. Now we're continuing to go through the additional sites to do full testing, to know the full impact of the surrounding communities so that we can continue to do remediation at every single site here.
Since the discovery, private granular activated carbon filters, GAC systems, and point-of-entry treatment systems, POET systems, have been installed to filter out the toxins in residents' homes. Mayor Dan Schuttig, a village trustee and longtime resident, replaced Allen Tuesday. Schuttig says when the contamination was first identified, he was apprehensive.
We all hear those stories sometimes, and it did turn out to be. So it was obviously, as a resident at the time, it was very concerning. And thankfully, I had my wife as an engineer, so she was able to explain a lot of that stuff to me. And then joining the village board 3 years ago, it was nice to see the progression towards a final settlement.
He says with incoming grants and settlements to be reached with Honeywell and St. Gobain, the village is in good financial shape heading into this new chapter.
It's nice to just see the whole thing come to a close. I think we're entering really a new time frame for our village. We have a lot of different funds coming in, the New York Forward and everything else, that we can do some revitalization around here, because to say that this sucked the air out of the room for a few years would be an understatement.
PFAS contamination has been found in several New York communities, including Petersburg, Post-and-Kill, Newburgh, and Bennington, Vermont. WAMC has reached out to Honeywell and St. Gobain for comment. For the Legislative Gazette, I'm Samantha Simmons.
And that about does it for this week's show. The Legislative Gazette is a production of WAMC, Northeast Public Radio. We had help from the New York Public News Network. You can listen anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcasts. Look for program number 2514. And join us again next week at this same time for more news on New York State government and politics. For the Legislative Gazette, I'm David Gustina. Support for the Legislative Gazette comes from United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org.